Other than that, it's a great pleasure to welcome Michael Northcott, who's a reader in divinity at Edinburgh. And he's going to talk today about climate change, as you can see, and the moral implications of it, some theological perspectives on that, which we're looking forward to greatly. He's been thinking in this area for quite a while. He wrote a book in 1996, which was related, but specifically he's got a book with almost the same title. I don't know what your title is, but it's probably very similar to this, coming out in January next year. So I hope this is a preview of part of it, and it will make us eagerly await the real thing. So thank you very much, and I'll hand over to you.
Last September, there we are, the journal New Scientist published photographs of pools of water sitting on land that used to be permafrost in Siberia. Scientists reported that not only was the permafrost melting, but that, there's another one here somewhere, that, unfortunately lost it, never mind, you can sort of see there what they're talking about. I mean, this is land, this is tundra that would have been frozen. And now what's happening is in the summer, the topsoil is literally ponding. And the worry is that the vast amounts of methane stored in frozen form, methyl hydrates as they're known, under the topsoil in Siberia. I mean, really gigantic amounts. I haven't got the precise figure here. And what scientists found last summer was that the methane was beginning to bubble up through this ponding water on the surface. Now that is deeply, deeply troubling. Methane is 24 times as powerful as in terms of its capacity to warm the planet as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. It doesn't last as long, it only lasts about 10 years. But nonetheless, it's thought that if all the methyl hydrates, which are in the tundra, and furthermore under the ocean, particularly on the eastern seaboard of the United States, there's a very large amount of methane sitting there, frozen under the ocean, which could also be released if the ocean warms enough. The worry is that amount of methane coming up into the atmosphere all at once will produce what they call a kind of tipping point, where the climate goes into this kind of irreversible heating. So this evidence from Siberia was particularly troubling because it was a real physical indicator that we might be approaching a much worse climate event than has yet been predicted. In November 2005, so just a couple of months later, the British Antarctic Survey reported a rise in atmospheric temperature of 3 degrees centigrade in the last 50 years in both the Antarctic and in the Antarctic. This is just a photograph of the ice shelf melting, but as the article points out, Antarctica is already losing the equivalent of Loch Ness 18 times over. It's a nice Scottish example for me. And it used to be thought, I mean, Antarctica was always ahead of the game because it always snowed more than it melted, because of precipitation. But things are now changing, and the mass of Antarctica is actually now reducing, and this has been proved through satellite measurements and other techniques. This is very, very troubling. In total, sea level rise from Antarctica, the whole thing melted, is 84 meters. I mean, obviously that's hundreds of years, and possibly thousands, on current trajectories. But the point is, we are really, if you accept the hypothesis or the thesis that global warming gases are causing these things, we're not just looking at, even a meter. I mean, that would threaten Cambridge, I think, a meter would threaten Cambridge. But 84 meters would leave rather sparse parts of the planet on which humans could actually continue to live. So it is pretty troubling. Of course, in terms of the effects of these events, I'm not going to look at all the data right now. I just wanted to show you a couple of photographs, if I can find them. This is Hurricane Katrina, a photograph of that extraordinary anticyclone, one of the strongest in recent years. The crucial point about Katrina wasn't that it was especially strong, but it was the way it hit the land and the length of time it was sustained on the land. And scientific papers since Katrina have been arguing that it's the rise in temperature in the Gulf of Mexico, which is causing not a larger number of hurricanes, but is causing them to endure for longer and therefore to do more damage over land than they had done before. This is a pattern that people are now seeing clearly in the work. And of course, this is. But as with so many of these events, though, this is the effects in Katrina were magnified dramatically by human folly. The Mississippi is basically the drain of the Midwest. The Midwest has been pouring topsoil of its land into the Mississippi Basin for 40 years or so from unsustainable agricultural practices. It ends up it produces this large kill zone in the Gulf of Mexico. But also what's happening is it's raising the level of the river, so that New Orleans is now below the river, as well as significant parts of New Orleans now actually below the ocean as well. So, I mean, clearly Katrina did a lot of the damage it did, not because of Katrina, but because of the folly of really living 500 meters below sea level in a flood-prone and storm-prone area. But the people who are really suffering in dramatic ways from climate change are not the residents of North America, who are mostly getting private insurance. They get public insurance and state subsidies for living in hurricane-prone areas, but people in Tanzania, in the Sahel. Again, the scientific papers in recent years have linked persistent drought in the Sahel, which has been going on really now for at least 10 years, with risen temperatures in the Indian Ocean of up to 2 degrees centigrade. There's a similar problems in Niger, in Mali, so further west in Africa from the Sahel. And increasingly now, this is the previous slide was from Tanzania, you have increasing drought now, Tanzania, even in Kenya, Malawi. Much of sub-Saharan Africa now is just receiving much less rainfall than it used to do. And the weight of scientific opinion is increasing, and this is partly through human influence. Obviously, some of it is local climate change precipitated by deforestation. But with what's happening in the Indian Ocean, the balance of opinion now seems to be that actually it's much more a global problem than a local problem. Well, there is now unanimity amongst university-based, that's an important qualification, amongst university-based climatologists, that the growing frequency and force of extreme weather events in the last 30 years is a consequence of increases in ocean and land temperatures of between 0.3 and 6 degrees centigrade. There are a couple of charts here which demonstrate this. This is only over just over 100 years, but it shows fairly clearly the departure from a norm that we are now experiencing, particularly that spike in the late 90s associated, of course, with very hot summer in Europe and thousands of deaths from excessive heat in France, actually, that summer. This shows you the same effect over a 1,000-year period. And of course it's extrapolated into the future in the famous and much criticised hockey stick graphic. This is now known as the hockey stick graphic, and is regularly derided in Congress because it's said to exaggerate so much what's yet happened. And clearly there is, it's in one sense hyperbole, but only if you assume that we don't change our behaviour. And the evidence so far is that we aren't going to change our behaviour. So it isn't really that much hyperbole, but it's represented as being so by American naysayers and one or two Danes, for example, Professor Longborg, I should say. Now, of course, industrial civilization, which is creating this climate change, has been made possible by fossil fuel burning, and the full extent of the amount of CO2. This is just one greenhouse gas, but it's the most significant one because it lasts for over 100 years, and in some form carbon can last up to 1,000 years. In soil, for example, it can last much longer than that. of course, it can be, I mean, in subsoil and in fossil fuels, it's been there for millions of years. The point is, we have released large amounts of carbon from under the Earth's surface into the atmosphere in the last roughly 250 years, and much of it is still in the atmosphere. And we are now experiencing, the climate is now experiencing the consequences of that. Again, the climate change deniers often say, but you know, we've been doing this since 1750, and we've only had 0.6 degrees centigrade warming. Scientists are exaggerating. But what you have to look at, if you look at this graph, and I can't quite cut it off, I mean, I didn't have the ability to do so, but if you go up to 1900, you see that the quantity of carbon release is actually really quite small. I mean, it's less than, it's probably about 20% of the total. Between 1900 and 1950, then, you've got double that quantity, roughly. And 1950 and 2000, I think it's something like quadruple the quantity that's been released. I mean, John Houghton has more precise figures on that in one of his books. But the point is, much of the carbon that's doing the damage is being released in very recent years, and that is why we're now beginning to see much clearer effects on the climate than we might have seen in, say, 1850. Industrial civilization, then, is made possible by this industrial, this drawdown, effectively, of stored sunlight. This is what carbon is. It's effectively stored sunlight, subterranean stored sunlight, and its release into the atmosphere. And it is, in a sense, and it is becoming the single most significant scientific exemplar of the extent to which the industrial relationship with nature is one of conquest. Anticipated by Francis Bacon in those very terms at the dawn of the Renaissance. But it's fossil fuel which has enabled that conquest to become reality. The Earth's crust still contains sufficient fossil fuels to continue the rate of consumption that we are currently enjoying, if that's the right word, for many hundreds of years, though not in the conveniently fluid form of oil, which is approaching in production. I mean, some people think 2010, 2015, but we're not far off. Peak of discovery of oil was about 15, no, I think even earlier than that, 20 years ago. The discoveries now are going down, not up, in terms of the amount that's being found. Climate change threatens human and non-human life. And particularly, as I said, in the less developed South. Because both of the increase in the frequency of extreme weather events and because of the more limited ability of people in less developed countries to survive such events. Prolonged drought and reduced crop outputs in southern Africa are the single most life-threatening effect of climate change because of the considerable and continuing poverty of the continent of Africa. The climate change is also threatening to other regions. This is not a Nepalese glacier, but it's a rather striking example of a glacier melting. What scientists are finding is that glaciers are melting much faster than had been predicted. Because what happens is that in the summer, you get this effect of water on the surface of the glacier, and it ponds, a bit like with the tundra. And what happens is when it ponds, it then goes down into the crevices. And they've now found that it's acting, the meltwater is acting as a lubricant. So in Greenland, we're seeing now rates of, instead of 5 kilometers a year movement of a glacier, we're now seeing 13 kilometers. Now that's in 15 years increase. I could send you the papers if you're interested, but this is all recently in Science on Nature. So glaciers are melting really fast. Now there are many communities around the world which actually live off glaciers. I walked in Nepal some years ago, beautiful, beautiful 3 weeks walking around the Annapurna range, and in the town of Manang, 3,000 meters, the only water is glacial meltwater. And the rate that the glaciers are melting in Nepal, that town will not be able to, it won't be there anymore in just 30 years from now. Another community that is deeply affected by climate change is, of course, in the Bangladesh Delta. More than 100 million people are at risk from extreme flooding in this part of the world. So climate change is, perhaps more than any other environmental problem, one which threatens human life, and particularly one which threatens the poor. The International Panel on Climate Change, just in their third assessment report, suggests that up to 3 billion people, mostly in the southern hemisphere, will be displaced or suffer serious threats to their well-being if greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise unchecked in the 21st century. 3 billion, that's an incredibly large number of people. The panel of scientists who comprise the IPCC estimate that if the level of CO2 in the atmosphere can be kept below 450 parts per million, it's possible that sea level rise can be kept to a level of only 2 meters, and atmospheric temperature rise is restricted to only 3 degrees centigrade. But even this degree of heating and the speed at which it's happening will be unprecedented in Earth history. Never before has the globe warmed at this pace. So what we're doing now is, even in geological time, unprecedented. And the speed of the warming carries a grave risk, as I've already suggested, of us reaching a tipping point where a range of events will trigger the kind of apocalyptic climate change scenario that was put forward in that scientifically ambiguous but nonetheless interesting film, The Day After Tomorrow. I think it's unlikely that we're going to have long winters here very soon. Though having said that, they were skiing in Cairngorms on fresh snow on Monday, which is curious. The possibility that carbon emissions could enhance the greenhouse effect, the idea has been around quite a long time. It was first proposed in 1896, but it's only very recently that scientists have come around to a widespread view that it is the case, that this is actually happening. For most of the 20th century, natural scientists dismissed the possibility that human impacts were powerful enough to change the climate of the planet. They reflected in this resistance a Newtonian view of cause and effect, which argued that the Earth was essentially a machine whose behaviour was according to fixed and predictable laws with which neither God nor humans are capable of interfering. This mechanical model unseated a much older model, reflected in the story of Noah, the first climate change prophet who was ignored, which promised a close interaction between human behaviour, or which presumed, let us say, a close interaction between human behaviour and the behaviour of the weather. In the classical world, and in Christian tradition until the rise of modernity, it was just assumed that cosmology and ethics, metaphysics and morality were related. The rehearsal and the worship of Christians and Jews of foundational creation myths of creation and society sustained connections and interactions between divinity and society, cosmos and humanity, animal and spirit, such that climatic and other biophysical events were said to be interconnected with human morality and humanity's relationship with the divinity. And so when Adam and Eve first disobeyed God in the Garden of Eden, their actions are said to have had biological consequences, according to the Genesis narrative. And similarly, when the New Testament begins with genealogy, it is making a theological claim about political and social order, which is at the same time a biological claim about natural order. The order of generations from Adam to Christ and the apostles is a natural sign of the new order of being, which is inaugurated in the events of Christ's birth, life, death, and resurrection. And when Christ, the Son of God, is crucified on the cross, the Gospel narrators record that the earth quaked and the sun was darkened. You see, it was inconceivable to the writers of the New Testament and of the Old that such a momentous event, and others like it, presaging as they did the transformed moral and the transformation of the moral and the spiritual order, could have happened without the attestation of natural science. Anyone who has ever studied the great cathedrals of Europe will be aware of the influence of this kind of sacred cosmology on medieval Gothic architecture. The way in which Gothic structures draw down the light of the cosmos into the spaces of worship and prayer through their elevated arched windows is a powerful exemplar of sacred cosmology, and one which is peculiar relevance to thinking about global warming. Those who designed and built medieval worship spaces assumed a unity between the human and the cosmic good, so that the key physical constituents of created order, light, space, time, weight, played a central role in the ordering, and arrangement of the rituals of daily life and the spaces of worship of medieval people. Similarly, the synergy between the agricultural and the liturgical year provided an example of the way in which natural rhythms shaped the moral and spiritual life of pre-modern Europeans. If the cosmos is sacred and manifests in its physical reality the shaping hand of the beneficent creator, then there ought to be some fit between biological reality and the productive economy. However, the influence of early modern atomistic science has been powerful in Western philosophy as well as natural science, so that human behaviour and morality have increasingly been decontextualised from their ecological settings. The 16th century preacher and poet John Donne argued that the result was a philosophy, a new philosophy, which involved a loss of coherence as the age in which Donne lived increasingly embraced atomism instead of unity. And it's just a wonderful excerpt from Donne. New philosophy calls all in doubt. The element of fire is quite put out. The sun is lost, the earth, and no man's wit can well direct him where to look for it. And freely men confess that this world's spent, when in the planets and the firmament they seek so many new, they see that this is crumbled out again to his atoms. It is all in pieces, all coherence gone, all just supply, all relation, prince, subject, father, some are things forgot. For every man alone thinks he hath got to be a phoenix, and that there can be none of that kind of which he is, but he. It's an amazingly prophetic poem. I mean, I just think it's stunning. And note how Donne specifically links atomistic physics and rationalist individualism with the inability to understand the cosmic significance of fire and sun, or to discern the sacred Trinity. There's so much in these few lines, it's astonishing. And what more powerful metaphor for the crisis of global warming could there be than that every individual imagines herself as her own unique phoenix, her own energy supply. This imagined uniqueness displaces the gods from the cosmos, so the individual becomes his own world of meaning and disregards the impacts of the world, of their world, their individual world, on the larger biophysical as well as social order. This kind of solipsism trains modern individuals to refuse any relation between human morality and natural systems. And so they find it hard to believe there is a relationship between changes in the physical climate and individual behaviour. From Donne to William Blake and John Ruskin, there is a powerful English tradition of dissent at the ecological and moral consequences of atomism and rationalism. Blake and Ruskin both saw industrialism as the bastard child of these earlier mistaken traditions, and especially of their progenitor, Newton. Both criticised the loss of community and tradition, which the cornucopia of industrial consumerism and the human disciplines of industrial labour brought in their train. Donne himself is an authentic conservative voice, and he stands with Milton in Paradise Lost and with Yeats in his poem The Second Coming in lamenting a culture in which things fall apart and mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. For Donne and Yeats, as for the Gospel writers and the Hebrew prophets, a storm on a lake, the movements of a star, melting snow, are all exemplars of a larger unitive order, which links, as Stephen Tolman insightfully puts it, cosmos and polis. In this, these writers are much closer to the world of the New Testament than the Newtonian worldview. To take just one example, for the Gospel writers, Christ's stilling of the storm is not mere happenstance, any more than the star which guides the Magi to Bethlehem. The storm which engulfs the disciples on the Sea of Galilee before Christ calms wind and waves symbolises the attempts of the imperial and religious authorities to resist the divine power and wisdom of the Son of God come to earth. The storm is both cosmic and political. Similarly, for Donne in the 16th century, the Little Ice Age, which froze the Thames, caused widespread crop failure and famine, was indicative that the material order was responding to the loss of coherence in the early modern vision of the world. The early modern rupture of cosmos and polis has considerable implications for the human response to global warming. Climate scientists who claim to find a biophysical response to the modern industrial economy in the behaviour of the planet are paradoxically involved in the recovery of an ancient conception of physics, which from Jeremiah and Aristotle to Aquinas and Donne linked human economy and politics with the material cosmos. But moderns have been trained by Newton and by industrialism to discount such cosmo-political connections as superstitious speculation, closer to witchcraft than rational logic. While generative or extraordinary advances in the human capacity to transform the material world after human desires, Newtonianism fostered the illusion that there are no biophysical parameters to or relationships between the expression of human desires and the constitution of the natural world. And there is no more powerful a place where one can see the effects of this Newtonian view still in operation than in economics. It's beginning to be displaced in natural science, but economics is still almost entirely modelled on Newtonian notions that the cosmos is a mechanism and we are all individual centres of value, and firms and individuals behave rationally when they behave without regard to the others around them. That climate change is already happening. It's not any longer in doubt. However, politicians and corporations and citizens have been really quite lackadaisical in their response to it thus far. Britain has kept within its promises and targets in relation to the Kyoto Accord solely because of the move from coal to gas. Because Margaret Thatcher hated miners, we are saving the planet, or Mr. Blair is saving the planet. This is, to me, I don't find this very convincing. I mean, little at all has been done on transport to integrate it. They're proposing to build more, as you know, more runways, including in Stansted. What we need are more railway lines, it seems to me. I mean, the pressure on the East Coast and West Coast main line is impossible. But there's always money for a new motorway, never for a new railway in this country. But there are many other areas that I could go into where inaction rather than action is unfortunately the state of things. Which is not to say the government is not investigating and not commissioning. There's lots of great work being done by civil servants and scientists commissioned by government in this area. But I don't see government policy picking up on the good work that I do see and read a good deal of in papers from the scientific and executive community at the moment. I think the problem with our lack of response to climate change is partly cosmological, which is why I'm arguing in the book and in this paper we need to recover a moral cosmology. We've been trained both by philosophy and science increasingly to read our moral choices as having no implications for the material world. And then to identify the human good with our capacity to freely choose from as large a range of preferences as possible. And that model of the human good and of human welfare is still driving our economics, it's still driving government policy. I mean, just to give a simple example, you know, the idea that if you have a choice of 3 hospitals, you'll be a happier patient than if you just go to one good local hospital is a very good example of this. I mean, I don't think it's not the same philosophy, but especially not in geophysical and geochemistry times, because the movement involved, the constant movement of people and goods that this philosophy is actually requiring is climatically unsustainable. Now, in the Christian tradition, as in other ancient cultures, the key device for educating and training desires so that they don't do crazy and insane things is the telling of stories. Stories are central to an ethical character, for in stories we learn the kinds of behaviours that are to be admired and mirrored, and the kinds which are to be prescribed and avoided. Reading stories is central to Christian liturgy because in their retelling, Christians find the resources to mimic and perform the kinds of moral discernment and wisdom which the people of God through the ages have practiced. And there are 2 foundational biblical stories where individuals act prudently in response to climatic disaster that I now want to talk about in a few minutes. And these are the stories of Noah and Joseph. In the first story, Noah learns in a vision that God intends to make it rain for months and to flood the earth because the wickedness of humankind on earth was great. In preparation for the coming inundation, Noah begins his great ark project, according to divine instruction and at the cost of the ridicule of his neighbours. They are content in their lives, they do not suspect that disaster will befall them, and they think Noah and his family are off their heads. When the flood comes, the only ones who survive are those, animal and human, whom Noah has seen safely aboard his ark. The biblical story of the flood echoes similar accounts of primordial inundation in the ancient Near East, like the Gilgamesh epic, which likely had their roots in an actual geological event. Around 5,600 BC, the rising waters of the Mediterranean precipitated, rising that is because of gradual melting since the previous ice age, 15,000 years previously, or 10,000 years previously to this event. The rising waters of the Mediterranean precipitated the inundation of the deep basin that contained the freshwater lake Euxine and resulted in the formation of what we now know as the Black Sea. This ancient saga is not only a powerful story of human survival in the face of a climatic catastrophe, but also a moral tale in which the flood is seen as a divine punishment for a generation of humans who have become so depraved that, as the author of Genesis puts it, every planning and striving of its heart was always only wicked. And as the narrator also suggests, the wickedness which had affected all humans was such that it affected all flesh on earth and endangered even the earth itself, which was as a result full of violence. The narrator picks up a theme from the opening chapters of Genesis, in which the sin of Adam and Eve is said to have effects not only on their children and children's children, but on the earth itself. Now, this Noahic narrative reflects a cosmological belief shared by the ancient Hebrews and other Mesopotamians that the forces of creation, the natural elements, are given order by divine power, and that these forces were perceived as originally chaotic and violent, and as being held in check by the Creator Spirit. This narrative of order out of chaos is displayed in a range of Old Testament texts, such as, of course, Genesis 1:1, that speaks of the divine spirit in the face of the waters. The sea is seen in this ancient text, as it is by modern evolutionary scientists, as the original source of life. Life literally emerges from the oceans onto land. Life is first found in the oceans. And the land is said to have been founded upon the seas. And it is the divine restraint of the sea, the provision, as Jeremiah has it, of barriers beyond which the ocean may not pass, which is seen as that which makes life possible. And so you see, when, as in the case of the Noah story, the flood, the sea gets out of control, life is threatened. The control of the sea is seen as being connected with divine ordering of and restraint of otherwise chaotic forces. Now, I find it intriguing that recent scientific descriptions of climate change do find some accord with the biblical narrative of a stable climate uniquely provided by God in the last 15,000 years to enable humans to spread and multiply, as we've done amazingly well over this earth. When you actually look back at the climate record that's been now put together from ice core evidence, you find that in the last 15,000 years we have a uniquely stable period when this geological time, constant encroachment of ice water and meltwater onto land diminishes to the point that we have really remarkably stable temperature and a remarkably stable sea level. And it's that which has made civilization possible. The extent of our civilization would be unimaginable without this fundamental climate fact. And what's very troubling is that many of the climate change deniers will say, oh, but just look at the record of climate over the last 2 million years. We've now got it, thanks to the ice core studies. It shows a constant movement like this. But the last 15,000 years does not show that movement. And we could not have the number of humans, the extent of our civilization, without the kind of climate stability that we have only recently, in geological time, enjoyed as a species. Now, the other, I'm going to skip some of the paper. I'll gladly email it to people who want to read it, but I also want to get some time for discussion in to our hour. But I'll just give you a quote from Jeremiah on the way. Does the snow of Lebanon vanish from a lofty crag? Do the proud waters run dry, so coolly flowing? And yet my people have forgotten me, they burn their incense to a nothing. They have lost their footing in their ways on the roads of former times, to walk in tortuous paths away unmarked. They will make their country desolate, everlastingly derided. Every passer-by will be appalled at it and shake his head. See, Jeremiah, like the writer of Genesis, and like Dante and Shakespeare, believed that there was a relationship between human moral behaviour and the state of the earth. And so when he saw desertification, salinization of Israelite farms, declining fertility of their fields, when he saw snow melting on the mountains of Lebanon where it had once been all year round, he connects it with human disobedience and with the human abandonment of what I suggest in another of my books is a cosmic covenant, a covenant between God, humans and the land. When the Israelites broke the covenant, the land itself suffered, and not just other human beings. The cosmic description of the covenant, like the Genesis stories of Adam and Noah, trains Jews and Christians to see that humans are morally as well as physically implicated in the fate of the earth and in its climate. In this perspective, the profligate use of energy in industrial societies is a moral problem, not solely because of present or future threats to human survival, but because of the spiritual harms to human moral character represented by the extraction and consumption and heedless use of energy. Infinite consumption is not producing better or more moral human beings or a better society. As Wendell Berry puts it, the energy crisis is not only occasioned by climate change or the future unavailability of oil, but by the threats to human moral character, the good life and the good society, occasioned by the habitual dependence of modern consumers on the systematic waste of the Earth's energy reserves in the modern economy. Now, the conventional narrative of climate change indicates that it represents a potential threat to future persons. But as I've already shown to you in some brief photographs, subsistence farmers in Bangladesh and in Africa are already being affected very significantly by climate change. I heard the Archbishop of Tanzania speaking about this very passionately at a conference in Edinburgh around the time of the G8 summit in July last year. Now, the physicalist scientist imagines that the threat of physical harm from climate change, provided it can be described with a minimum of uncertainty, should be enough to persuade the population of the need to abandon its energy-hungry ways. But the scientific description of climate change is not persuasive because it does not describe the real moral and spiritual and cosmological perils represented by a limitless energy consumption. And furthermore, it fails to recognize the physical harms which the modern extractive economy already visits on those people and those non-human species whose land areas contain the fossil fuels, the power stations and the waste dumps on which this extractive economy relies. The point is that the free availability of energy to fuel comforts and lifestyles with their daily dependence on machines and entertainment devices produce people and lives which lack moral depth and spiritual vigour. Climate change, in other words, is not simply a physical event. There is a moral and a spiritual dimension to it, which we as Christians and theologians ought to be aware of. Now, the other climate change prophet in the Old Testament, who I think is particularly interesting as a counterexample to Noah, is that of Joseph. And Joseph's story offers a much more hopeful scenario than does Noah's. Joseph's warnings of imminent climate change are heeded by Pharaoh. And Pharaoh commissions Joseph to reorganize the agricultural economy of this large empire of ancient Egypt in order to store up resources to deal with the predicted drought and climate change that was going to follow. Now again, it's interesting that the ice core records reveal there was a real and quite long drought event in Egypt around 2000 BC that this story may in some way relate to, clearly longer than 7 years to showing up on an ice core record. But nonetheless, I do think it's interesting that we can find, again, an intriguing parallel. for me, the Joseph story is very powerful for a number of reasons. Not the least of these is because in the United States, where I spent a bit of time and began work on this book, the conventional account is that the nation-state is, how shall we say, idolatrous in the claims and blasphemous in the claims that it makes on human beings, and particularly in private property, and that the nation-state, when it regulates for environmental problems, is engaged in theft by reducing the value of private property belonging to individuals. Now, this is a very powerful narrative in the US. It's much more powerful than it is even here in Britain, though it does have some voters even here in some circles. I always think it's very tragic that political conservatives are not conservationists. I mean, I just think this is a fundamental problem with politics. We don't have a real conservatism in our politics in this country anymore, or in the United States and much of the world, actually. The real conservatives are all 19th century figures. I don't really see them in the 20th century. But anyway, that's another story, another paper. The point about Joseph is that he reorganizes the whole culture. He inaugurates what I argue is the first climate change tax, the first, almost we could say, carbon tax, certainly the first green tax, because he requires people to tithe their product in order to store up for future years and to make things safe. I think also the model of taxation in the Joseph saga is very interesting. It's a tithe on production, not a tax on income. More and more of the taxation in the West is moving from productive activity, as corporation tax shrinks, to employment and private income. Now, neither corporation tax nor private income addresses climate change. Carbon tax, moving towards green taxes, would address it very powerfully and significantly. And I think there are very good biblical exemplars for taxes on production rather than taxes on income. And certainly taxes on sales, which hit, of course, the poorest hardest. Well, my allotted time is up. I have, of course, more things that I could say. But I want simply to conclude by suggesting that the Joseph saga represents, it seems to me, a possible alternative scenario to the Noah saga. I'm not yet convinced that we have a Joseph or a wise Pharaoh in any of the major governments in the Western world. But I think that if there is a Joseph around, his name is probably Sir John Houghton, who writes, and indeed in his most recent book, Global Warming, the Complete Briefing, actually has a chapter where he addresses the link between his interest in climate change science and in addressing the problem of global warming and his Christian faith. In scientific circles, it can be quite difficult to come out and make those kinds of claims. Especially in monographs, you'd want to be respected in the scientific community. I think he's been just a wonderful exemplar of a Christian scientist in this field, and I think he is a prophet. Whether our government or whether corporations and citizens will listen, I think the jury's still out on that. Thank you.
Has anybody got anything else to say? Yeah.
Can I just question immediately? This is a long-term thing we're thinking about.
Yeah.
One of the problems in our democracy is that MPs seem particularly interested in short-term things.
Yes.
Short-term issues which get them elected.
Council elections.
How is this brought to affect the way people vote? Do we need a stronger Green Party? We have just seen wind turbines in Germany, which apparently are a result of Green Party politics.
Yes, I think it's a shame that our politics in this country is not moving in the environmental direction. I find it encouraging that David Cameron has been making noises along these lines. Frankly, I would vote for any politician of any stripe if I really thought this was going to be central to their concerns, because I think it is the most important issue in politics currently.
So how can they be made?
One of the other key theses of the book that I'm writing is that the energy economy has shaped our politics in ways that we don't fully appreciate. Oil required an empire. It was the product of empire and it required an empire, and it still requires an empire. That's why we still do everything that America asks of us. We began that project, the oil empire, and then we handed it over to them after the Second World War. Now, that means that oil and also the grid, the electricity grid, shape our politics to the extent that it gives us this sort of central delivery mentality. So we are at the end of, we receive a centrally provided resource, which seems to be completely essential to our civilization and our comfortable life. And I think that shapes our politics very powerfully. What I'm arguing in the book is that the technology which is going to save the planet, if anything can, it has to be local, and it has to be and it will be microgeneration. Not even wind turbines in Scotland. I don't think that will save the planet. I mean, because the grid itself is inherently inefficient, deeply inefficient. Something like about 10% of the energy used by the grid is available at the point of use in the house, and we lose a lot more. These I think, halogen lights, they probably have a transformer somewhere behind there, which is giving off heat. So that's another 5% gone. You see what I mean? So we have to use this resource more carefully. The only way we can use the earth more carefully is for us to have a more careful kind of politics. And that means a kind of politics where human relationships matter again, putting it very simply. And they don't matter when you simply have boxes on a piece of paper. Oliver O'Donnell makes this point in a book of his I'm reading called The Ways of Judgment, where he says, you know, people who eulogize about the Christian origins of democracy don't really face up to the fact that what you're offered up in the end of the day is a piece of paper with 5 boxes on it, all of whom most likely individuals who don't know. If that's the Christian ideal of democracy, then it cannot be Christian. He argues. I think he's right. So we need a new politics. I think environmentalism has been arguing for this for a long time. Climate change may perhaps begin to bring it about. To give an example, in the street where I live, you could have 10, 20 houses. If we all clubbed together and purchased a combined heat and power unit, it would massively reduce our energy impacts, more than anything the government could do. That would have far more of an effect. But currently, planning laws, utility regulation, all of that mitigates against that, because the whole thing is predicated on central delivery to us as consumers.
Patrick, yeah.
Many thanks for such a rich presentation. There's so much to think about. I may not be able to put a clear question across, but 2 points struck me more than once. One was that the sort of pre-modern view that the environment is affected by human morality does seem to involve a rather occult form of causality, that God or karma somehow operates to bring this parallel about. And of course the scientific revolution did sort of overthrow the sort of teleological view, and that perhaps links with what you're saying about Newton. But I think to gain credibility in circles which aren't going to give you lots of benefits of the doubt for your use of scripture, you've got to reclose that causal gap. And I thought that you might have been doing so towards the end, and when you talk about sort of the economic model not generating good in a fully moral sense, but it still seems to me that you need to face up to the fact that many people thought they were acting in a Christian way in conquering culture, but you can appeal to all sorts of different factors. So Newton thought he was offering a new natural theology, and many of his followers. So it seems to me that one problem you've got is reclosing the causal link between the environment and our behaviour, especially given the fact that generating wealth has done amazing things to improve lifespan in our country. Our National Health Service swallows money, and the sort of politics that I think you may be moving towards just looks to me to be a big step forward, and a lot of technology, some of which does seem to have manifestly good outcomes, could well fall because of that. It just depends so much on the wealth creation. And the other thing that's
Can I answer that first, because I went on again. I think I'd like to put the comparison between, say, a plague cosmology and a moral cosmology. In a plague cosmology, you literally have, Pharaoh says no one day, and the next day the Red Sea turns red. Now this seems to me to be problematic, and it's a cult. But what the moral cosmology I'm arguing for is much closer to Lovelock's hypothesis, Gaian hypothesis, which of course 30 years ago was revolutionary. But now you have whole journals, textbooks written in what is now called the science of biogeochemistry. And biogeochemistry is basically Gaian science. It accepts that there is a carbon cycle, and that we as mammals, even the air we breathe and the CO2 produced, is part of the carbon cycle. Now, it seems to me that therefore we don't, that moves us on from the occult back into real science, and that's what I try to show in the book. So I completely accept that, you know, as moderns we would say, well, Dante and Shakespeare and Aristotle were wrong in their theories of causation, but in the underlying moral assumption, biology and chemistry is proving that they were right. And that in that short period, about 300 years, we were more deluded than our predecessors. Do you see what I'm trying to say? So that's what I'm arguing. And Newton did certainly play his part in that, I think. But I quite agree that it's important to close the gap, and I'm trying fairly hard to do that in this book. Thank you.
I'd like to take another question.
You gave a fairly standard view of carbon change. That's by academics, as you said, and I can't respond overall to what you said, but just rhetorically, what would our reaction be if the level of carbon dioxide was found to be going down rather than up? And I think that would be far more alarming. Anyway, I also want to, you know, give for the people who aren't sort of up to speed on climatology or whatever we're going to call it, the fact that obviously they're using it as leverage to get atomic power back on the agenda. Successfully, well, in my opinion. But also, quite interestingly, they're avoiding publicising the hot rocks, which the Queen uses under Buckingham Palace, and which the council in Cornwall, I've discovered, being used down there, which produces amplifies the energy needed to be put in by a quarter. You don't need to put a quarter of much energy into it, you're heating out. But on the question of atomics, most people don't believe there's nowhere we can put the atomic waste. Well, the best answer would be to send it to the sun, which we know more costly than sending anything else into space. Failing that, put it down in the ocean where the plates are being subducted, and it will more or less get mixed up and lost in what the core of the Earth is after all, where all the heavy elements of the solar system are, apart from those in the sun.
Yep.
Okay.
Well, yeah, obviously nuclear power is one of the options which I will be discussing in the book. The carbon accounting for nuclear power, I think, is rather problematic. I was pleased to see that Zach Goldsmith made this point in an article I read by him last week. You know, he's the new kind of conservative whiz kid on nature conservation. The other problem is simply cost. No one's ever made nuclear power pay. We as taxpayers picking up, the figures are always incredible, but they're billions and billions of pounds, and the city has never invested seriously in this technology because they know that it's not economically viable. The tragedy is that for 30 years, nuclear power has stalked renewable energy in this country, ever since the days of Howard Marshall ran the CEGB. And all kinds of choices were made to reduce research into wave and wind power and solar in this country, and to favour this technology, primarily for export reasons. If you go down the nuclear route, you've got to say that every country, is it 187 on Earth, ought to be able to have one. Well, look at the current argument with Iran. The Americans talk about bombing Iran in some circles.
Bombing someone, haven't they? Come on.
You know, so that's the problem. I just think that it's not a safe technology. But of course, that is less grounded in what I've been speaking about than some other matters. But that is my view for what it's worth. And my point about safety is less to do with cancers than to do with its potential as a source of fissile materials for use in conflict and terrorism. Yeah.
We have just one quick question and we should stop, so people can get away too.
I really appreciated the talk as well on the connection between the biblical models and the more recent scientific view. But a couple of things you said didn't seem to me to follow from what you were saying. For example, you had a down on the nation state, which seems also to be grounded in Scripture. In Deuteronomy, you get the nations given their own deities and so on. And also, getting back to Patrick's point, capitalism isn't bad per se, because it produces lots of benefits. So,
well, both of these are obviously as eminently revisable institutions, both the nation state and capitalism. I am not proposing in this book that either of them should be abolished, although they were not necessarily part of God's providence in some way in their birth and origin. My main account of being down on the nation state was from the American right. I mean, I personally, I don't think the nation state is fundamentally a moral problem. But the way that it functions, I think, can be, and not least because of the short-termism that's already been referred to. As for capitalism, the biggest problem there, I think, is the guiding models of human economic activity.
But then it can do a job for you if you have carbon taxes and so
Absolutely,
on.
yes. I happen to think, though, that neither the nation state nor capitalism alone will be enough. I think we also need moral communities and moral individuals, and this is, again, to come back to a kind of Christian and Jewish and biblical perspective. The assumption in political economy since the 18th century, or perhaps even since Locke, has been almost Newtonian, that if you get the structures right, things will just fall into place. It's mechanicalist, in other words. And I think that mechanicalism has served us no better in political economy than it has served us in physics. And if we can recover from its infection in the one, we ought to be able to recover eventually from its infection in the other. But it's taking us a lot longer, it seems to me. I mean, Lovelock's hypothesis has changed the way most scientists look at the world in 30 years. But it ain't changing the way politicians and economists and voters look at the world. And that's the big problem we now face, it seems to me.
I think that's a good note to stop on. I'd just like to say, before I thank you, that if it weren't for global warming, the temperature on Earth, the average temperature would be about 30 degrees centigrade lower, so the whole Earth would be sub-zero and mammals wouldn't be here. So global warming is a good thing in moderation. I think the problem is the rate of change since the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, hence the word anthropogenic in my type.
Anthropogenic, indeed.
Yes, anthropogenic global warming is not a good thing.
That's what
That's what I'm arguing.
that sort of thing.